Yes, I see numbers are creeping up as to those who are attending this webinar. My name's Steve Yates. Can we go on the next slide, please, Gary? I'm the chair of the Readiness Association, so I welcome everybody here today. And obviously, probably one of the most unprecedented times we've ever experienced. We have, during last year, ever since March time, been running regular webinars on COVID-19 exit and looking at specific issues that have been current at that time. Today, we're going to move on to something else. But before we do that, and I hand over to the chair for this debate, there's going to be Aaron Gracie, Dr. Aaron Gracie, who's the vice chair of the Readiness Association. I'd just like to go over a few points about the Readiness for those who aren't too sure about this organisation, which I currently chair. Gary, can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, can we move down a few of those, please? Yeah. I mean, our key thing here is 4 key areas that we're really focused on as an organisation. We want to be a body that freely connects content and ideas across the resilience spectrum. And that's quite challenging. We need your help here. One of the key things I just want to pass out to everybody is that we're looking for individuals who have written blogs or have specific blogs they'd like to write to contribute them for our general knowledge of people who visit our site and to assist us in trying to direct people to further knowledge of this subject matter, which is quite extensive when we look at it. Because we're an organisation that provides an informed and influential voice on aspects of resilience, hence why we're looking at frameworks here, emergency readiness frameworks. This is the key issue, which is, I think, certainly governments are still considering as they move forward. But at the same time, we're putting forward a whole range of things. We have a Twitter feed at Resilience News. And since I set it up some time ago, we've run something like about 21,000 tweets have been pushed out, but not ours. These are just trying to pull together information of things that have been happening that I feel have been relevant to our subject space. I'd also say to you, if you really want to follow us, to join our LinkedIn page. So we're going to start advertising this more. So far, we've been behind the scenes. This year is going to be different. So watch out for those changes that will be happening. We are a hub that brings together ideas, information, resources, sort of things I mentioned, from many organizations. And so if you represent organizations, we certainly like to talk to you and understand the way that we can bring this in to bring knowledge right across the piece. And we're a community. So our website, the resilienceassociation.org, as we build this up more with central source for resilience information, a pointer more than anything else to other sources, we're going to need your help to achieve this. Can we go on the next slide, please, Gary? Yeah, we got a vision, a mission, as you'd expect, and a strategic goal. But obviously, our strategic goal, we want to establish a Resilience Association, reach out to a wider community, provide a platform, hub, forum for the transfer of knowledge and collaboration. All the things just mentioned, the way that we're moving forward with other means. And we need the support of like-minded corporate partner organisations and members coming into this organisation. So I put it out to you guys to join us on that journey. Next part, please. Yeah, can we just bring all that lot up here? I've tried to break this down as an organisation. We've looked at this in some extent. What really forms the type of space we're working in. So there's lots of different subject matter areas here. The key issue is there's a lot more going on in the background. So we're not excluding anything. It's just these were our key start points of individuals working these topics. And so don't feel excluded. If you're working in somewhere slightly different, we'd like to talk to you as well. And next part, please, Gary. And because of that, we've started off running some special interest groups. Obviously, because of the current situation, they've been slightly put on the back burner, mainly because obviously we normally would meet up face to face, and that's not been possible for some time now. But the intention is to grow this group and move it into an international space. So next slide, please, Gary. So it's now time for the annual resilience debate. Just want to give a background there. If you have any questions as we're going through each of the speakers that are going to come up here, as a handover to Dr. Aaron Gracie, just use the chat facility here and send them through to through that chat facility. You know, we only have a short time now to go through a very wide area, but each time we've done this, by moving it reasonably fast, it certainly generates lots of good ideas, questions, etc. So don't be shy, please put them forward. Next slide, please. So, Aaron, I'm just going to hand over the host to yourself.
Okay, cheers, Steve. Okay, thanks, Steve. I've got control.
Thank you very much, sir.
No problem. Okay, so first things first, welcome to today's Resilience Association annual debate. You know, this year, 2021, it's been decided to focus on COVID-19 and what we've seen, what's happened around it, and the level of emergency preparation and readiness around the frameworks that we've seen across the globe. And especially today, we're going to look at examples from the US, the UK, and Middle Eastern states. And our speakers will discuss those areas. Now, just a little bit to set the scene. So you look at it, in 2019, the Global Health Security Index placed the US and UK first and second, ranked first and second respectively, as the two nations most likely able to manage with a global pandemic. 2020 and 2021, the realism is very different from what was on paper. And actually the ability to manage that, the impact of that, of the COVID-19 has far outstretched what was written down on the paper. And what we've seen is lower rate nations such as South Korea and New Zealand have fared far better than those Western nations that were identified as being more capable of responding to a large scale global pandemic. So what we look at there is, you know, and looking at that, I got this right, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, so which is the international organization that looks at creating better lives, it has delivered a paper on the impact of COVID-19, you know, and looking at how effective governments at all levels have been at managing this crisis, okay, and finding out why have they struggled to deal with this in such a way. You know, and it's not just the UK, the US, you know, you look across the majority of Europe and the globe, and most nations have struggled to deliver a capable and comprehensive approach to the pandemic. You know, and digging into it a little bit further, the importance of building that resilience capability and stuff like that. You know, CEOs in 2019, you know, research by BCI identified that they were also concerned about the resilience of organizations and the need to start thinking about building a holistic approach to resilience. And this is something to consider not only at organization level, but also, you know, reaching out into the government levels as well. And how do we deal with it? You know, we're dealing with a VUCA world at the moment. You know, to use the American term, you know, the volatile, unknown, complex, ambiguous world. And this is where we find ourselves on a daily basis. And it's not like we're dealing with black swan events. You know, we are seeing more and more creeping tide events catching us out. And if you think about it, you know, the for example, COVID-19 pandemic was foreseen in 2017 by the Johns Hopkins University, where they created a whole exercise, you know, federal level exercise, looking at what would happen if a COVID type disease broke out in the US. And for those who want to research it, if you look at 2017, 2018, the Johns Hopkins University Research Group, the actual thing you're looking for is SPARS, the St. Paul's Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus. And they wrote the pandemic paper, they wrote the scenario, they wrote response periods. It was there, and the lessons identified and lessons learned. But then for some reason, when we actually met a disease very similar, the responses didn't seem to be there. So with all that in place, and as we've seen, you know, the COVID impact has hit both at government and local levels across the globe, with various industry and supply chains being pushed to breaking point and beyond. So the question we should be asking ourselves is what emergency readiness frameworks could meet the demands of such a pandemic. Because nations looking at, we have seen the various complexities of a federal centralized approach or a broken down localized approach, blend of two, and we've seen them being pushed to breaking point and beyond. So we have we have some speakers today from across the globe, and they're going to talk to us, about their, the way they've seen, based on their experience, their observations, and whether they're looking at the centralized or the decentralized approach, the pros and cons of each element, and how they think that element could cope with COVID-19 or a outbreak of something similar. So what I'll do is, the way I'll run this is I'll introduce each speaker. They will talk through their points, the discussions. And then when we finish that, I will then open up to the floor. So those that have questions, please feel free to throw them in via chat, as Steve indicated. The team will pull it across and we'll put it to the various individual. We'll then look at having some sort of online discussion, and then we'll then look at the key points and bring it to a close. So that's how we're looking at doing it. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across now to our first speaker, okay, who is Deraj La. And Deraj, who I'm now handing across to, okay, it's a little bit of background knowledge. And can we go to the next slide, please? Deraj has over 30 years experience in the industry. He's an ex-BCA sponsor and head of the American Express. He's got quite a lot of knowledge in this area. Okay? He's also been involved heavily in business continuity and has been involved in writing or contributing to several publications within the business community world. So without great effect, Deraj, over to yourself.
Thank you, Aaron. So I guess my video's on, so thank you so much. Thanks, Steve, for the invite. Interesting opening remarks, Aaron, and I have two different geographies to talk about. Chalk and cheese, exactly, almost diametrically opposite in many ways. And I guess there are some lessons there about what works and why that works. The UAE, could I have the next slide, please, Gary? Thank you. The UAE, I'd actually call it a new kid of the block. Very small country, literally go from one corner to the other in about 4 hours. Probably the advantage of no legacy, the advantage of having the opportunity to look at 20 years of BCM knowledge by the time they started to get serious about this area. So some great success stories, some great things to emulate. And you can always start from there and take it further, which is what they've done. So as a nation, a very well-respected authority, National Crisis and Emergency Management Authority of the UAE. Being a small country, people listen to it. So very well networked, highly centralized. The UAE has its own national standard. So it's one of the few countries in the world that has created its own standard. And the reason they did that is mostly because of local language. The national language of the country is Arabic, of the region in general. The governments typically speak in Arabic. That's the language in which ministries work. Till probably university, they learn in Arabic. So they start getting speaking English as part of their education actively only in university. And therefore, many of them think in Arabic. So that's one nation that actually came out with a standard in Arabic, translated into English. That has enabled embedding across the board. So while they're highly centralized, quick command and control, compliance, very strong connects, people listen to them, their word gets done. And to that extent, therefore, when they make decisions, those get implemented. Strong chain of decision-making. Interestingly, it's not just crisis and emergencies, as the name says, very, very much into resilience across the government and corporate sector. In fact, the focus is more on resilience within the government sector, because they believe if the government sector demonstrates resilience and appropriate practices, the private sector will follow suit. And that strategy has worked quite a bit. So in that sense, when the pandemic happened, they moved very quickly into the whole process. They didn't, like most entities, they also were not very focused at that point in time on pandemic. It was more overall situations, emergencies, crisis situations in general, but very quickly adapted because they did have a framework. That framework did build in pandemic, and to that extent were very quickly able to push out what had to be done. I think it was about March 4th when the first regulations came out about the need. So they canceled big events across the board. They canceled training, and over a period of time went into lockdown, went into some pretty strong practices, swabbed the streets daily in Dubai and some other countries, literally, and then started sort of laying off the controls and allowing people back. Currently, it's in a situation where a lot of the business is BAU almost. Most entities have people coming in alternate weeks, so have very well managed the transition. They are essentially a nation that is heavily dependent also on overseas goodwill, especially Dubai. So Dubai has really opened up the tourist sector again, especially over New Year. It was one of the few places people could go to. So interesting way of managing the situation, highly centralized, keeping things on track, and very, very directive. Things are back on normal by and large. They are now starting to suffer with the next wave. Perhaps slightly they overdid it, but they managed to pull back and they managed to bring things under control. So presumably that will happen. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay. India, diametrically opposite. Thank you. Diametrically opposite. Old nation, legacy, been there a long time, and in some ways that may be what pulls it back. Very large also. So I think one theme clearly that I seem to see, and may need to be validated by what the others say, is if you're small, you can be centralized, your voice is heard across the board pretty fast, and you can get your mandate through. If you're large and spread out, and some people joke that India is practically a continent, if that's the way it is, then by the time your voice gets heard, it could be a few days and everyone's on a different phase of the whole obedience cycle, if I can call it that. And then you're out of step, really. So India is actually exactly opposite, highly decentralized. Its actions are implemented through state disaster management authorities. And by and large, it's been a concept coming from the federal structure, but implemented and also with the ability to overrule it at a local level. So some cities have actually prohibited others from visiting them. So if I were to travel from place A to place B, there's a good chance I would need to quarantine exactly as I would with international travel. So they've by and large been autonomous in their decision making. Overall, each unit and state has managed their own recovery. Again, starting about a month and a half back, it was now let's get back to livelihood rather than just lives. So people even need to survive and bring in the economic money, while the government has done a few things in terms of trying to make sure that they cushion the blow. But let's get things back. So as a country, it's pretty much got back to normal, but a lot of it is still work at home. The stock market has gone crazy, amazingly. I mean, I wouldn't say there's anything that leads anyone to believe that things are absolutely hunky-dory, but the stock market is at a historical high. Overall confidence is pretty high. And what the country has done in the process is very quickly tried to develop a lot of indigenous capability, kind of dovetailing with, in case you're aware, we've had skirmishes on the border with China. China, like the world, is a big supplier to India. And due to these geopolitical issues and the fact that supply chain was disrupted, that's driven a lot of people to start developing internal alternatives to a lot of Chinese supplies. So we're probably, from that point of view, going to emerge more robust, certainly. From a social distancing and pandemic point of view, the numbers are looking really, really good. If you look at the size and scale of the country and the kind of chaos we could have had, seems that we've done a pretty remarkable job because overall, the numbers are really trending downwards and looking good. Possibly the largest campaign of vaccinations, few indigenous developed variants, a few from outside, including the Oxford vaccine. So that's been hugely in overdrive, and seems we are easily the largest program around, given the size of the population. So I think two different, very interesting approaches, but surprisingly, both of them have kind of led to the same results. So I think there's some introspection possible as to what works in what situation. And I would think that most of these two entities have got it right, more or less. If I just spend a moment on the Middle East, the Middle East is much more than UAE. They are certainly not at the UAE level. The UAE is far, far advanced, but the others take a cue from the UAE. And also, some of them, in fact, didn't shut down much. They kept going right through. And they've held their own. So I think different ways of doing it. Now, with that, I'll probably bring this to a close, pass on to Paul, and I guess the Q&A will be towards the end. So just hang on a sec, Paul, and I'm going to give you control. There you go.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I'll talk for a few minutes about what's been happening in the United States with regard to COVID-19. Next slide, Gary, please. In our situation in 2020, it was a difficult year for emergencies, especially the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which handles a large number of large-scale domestic events. Most of the media focused on COVID-19 because when it started back in like late February, early March, people really didn't have any idea what might happen as a result of this. So it's been kind of an uphill struggle here for COVID. But I just wanted to mention that aside from COVID, it was the busiest Atlantic hurricane season, and I live right along the Atlantic Ocean in a state called New Jersey, and while my area didn't get much in the way of severe weather, other parts of the country got some very serious hurricanes with billions of dollars in damage that FEMA had to take care of. We've also had a lot of difficulty with wildfires, mostly out in the western United States, and well over 4 million acres of land has been destroyed. Tens of thousands of homes have been destroyed. Many people have lost their homes, and fortunately there weren't too many deaths as a result of that. In 2020, FEMA, as you can see here, had well over 125 official disaster declarations, as opposed to only 15 in 2019. So it was a very, very busy year. FEMA is also responsible for an activity called the National Flood Insurance Program. Given the number of hurricanes and severe weather that the country endured last year, the National Flood Insurance Program is essentially running out of money. It needs to have more money because you can't go out to an insurance agent and get flood insurance. You have to. It's got to be coordinated through the government. Another issue, as far as FEMA is concerned, is that their staff is way under what their normal staffing should be. Again, indicating a funding problem. And based on what happened last year, it's clear that with things like climate change and a number of other activities that we're facing, FEMA has not only got to get more funding, which hopefully it will in the new administration, but it's got to be able to adapt to the emergency landscape, which continues to change. Next slide, please. With regard to COVID, our experience here has been an upward climb with a lot of falling off the edge and then climbing up again and falling off again. It's been a very difficult year. Things are beginning to settle down a little bit, but it's still a difficult place to be over here with regard to COVID. Now, as most of you probably have heard, two of the current COVID vaccines were developed over here, and and in well under a year, which is incredible, because most of the time the vaccines take several years to go through all the testing and all the evaluation. But the challenge here has been getting supplies of vaccine out to people who need it. There was a enormous lack of facilities to do the actual vaccinations, and those are coming online fairly quickly. But the problem has not only been manufacturing enough of the vaccine, but also getting the supplies out to the places where vaccinations can be made. There have even been situations where supplies that were set aside for the second of the 2 doses could be switched over to be used as an initial dose for vaccine candidates. I haven't had it, it hasn't actually happened yet, but it's been talked about in a number of big cities. Despite the work that's been done, it's still an uphill struggle. The positivity ratings for most of the states here are still very, very high. The likelihood of getting it is still relatively high compared with other countries. The new administration made a promise or a commitment, you call it, but 100 million people would be vaccinated in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. So needless to say, we've already had a few days go by. People are definitely getting vaccinated. The resources are still a problem as far as our supply chains. The federal government recently ordered 200 million doses, which of course translates into 100 million potential candidates for the vaccine. So the challenge is not only going to be to manufacture enough of the vaccine, but get it out to the healthcare organizations where the vaccine is going to be administered. As some of you may have heard, a company called Johnson & Johnson, which is a big pharmaceutical company over here, is well on its way at developing another COVID vaccine that supposedly only requires 1 dose as opposed to 2 shots for most of the other vaccines that are currently being used. So, I mean, personally, I'm in my 70s. I have not gotten the vaccine yet. A number of my friends have gotten it. I'm sort of trying to wait until things get sort of more stabilized in terms of the distribution and the supply of the vaccine. What I'm hoping also is that the Johnson & Johnson, the 1-shot vaccine, will be ready, so I won't have to worry about going through the hassle of getting a second vaccine. So in summary, we're starting to make some progress. We haven't turned any corners yet. The feeling is that most Americans could conceivably be vaccinated by the middle of this year, 2021. Are we on track? It's hard to say, but the progress has definitely been made as opposed to what's happened over the past year. So thank you for your listening, and I'm going to see if I can turn this over. Wait a minute, I got to, let's see, Joseph, stand by. Okay, switching over to Joseph.
Hi, Joseph.
Hi there. Can everyone see me?
Yep.
Indeed.
Yeah. Brilliant. So I'm going to try and make this completely non-political and completely non-academic at Steve's request. So what I'm looking at is the way the UK has responded to COVID, but also some other emergencies that we've been looking at over the past, and whether the UK's response has been right. So my first point is the UK has a response model enshrined in the Civil Contingencies Act. To my personal knowledge, it's been demonstrated in this that it's not well understood. All the major news TV channels have described it incorrectly. Boris has described it incorrectly. So there's a model there. But I think because there is no central point of expertise, there is no one who fully understands how it should be set up. Some of the debates that were had in the early stages of the pandemic around who should be sat on Sage, they wouldn't have happened if you had a central point of expertise that said, actually, yes, you've got the wrong people on Sage, it should be wider. And that did detract from the response because it has been tunnel vision in ways. So there's benefits there, but equally, I'll go on later to talk about the kind of the disbenefits that have come from this approach as well. So if I talk about kind of one of the, Steve wants me to inform. So Sage is the guys who give scientific advice to central government. So it was kind of misunderstood in this that Sage should be purely medical. And that's a common misunderstanding. It's a common misunderstanding at local level as well, that the equivalent should be purely related to the incident. Sage was there to give Cobra, who is the Cabinet Office briefing room, traditionally, is now just a political team. Sage give them advice on all of the wider scientific issues around the incident. One of the concerns that people have had around this pandemic is because that was purely in the early stages hosted by medical professionals, the response didn't cover the mental health impacts, the economic impacts. So some of those decisions around lockdown were being made purely on the advice of medical people who were always going to advise to lock down because that's the advice they should give. And what we don't have is actually a central team of professionals who can advise that as well. We have medical professionals giving advice and political members of parliament making political decisions. What we don't have is professional emergency planners at that national level directing how things are going to be carried out. So the way the UK models work is through something called the Local Resilience Forum, where all of the activity is delivered locally, which is why you see, move on to my next slide, please. Which is why we see some of the things in the early stages around the first people who were coming into the country who were infected, getting moved up to the Wirral. All of that action was taken by the Local Resilience Forum. They weren't supported by the national government in doing that. The counter to that, if you look at the second picture across, is Operation Stack. So Operation Stack is managed by Kent County Council and Kent Police and all the other partners in the Kent Resilience Forum. It's not an optimal solution. It was always described as the least bad option. I'll just quickly go through what these represent. So we've got Cygnus in the top left is an exercise that was carried out, Ebola, swine flu, and Operation Stack. These are all major incidents that affected the UK over the last few years. The common theme is that lessons were learnt, national level reports were written, and recommendations were made, but there is no central body of scrutiny that has gone down and said, have you actually incorporated all of the lessons? And that's something that obviously is coming along quite a lot at the moment, particularly with regards to exercise Cygnus. There were recommendations made in that exercise which simply haven't been taken on board. Can we go on to the next slide, please? And this is the downside of central government getting overly involved in local emergency planning. Without going into too much detail, this looks like a very neat and tidy 5-minute diversion for lorry drivers to nip up to Manston Airport, which is a disused airfield in Kent, stay for a while until Dover Docks is clear. Actually, Manston Airport is right up in the corner of the largest county in the country. It's about a 3-hour diversion going over several mini roundabouts that heavy freight vehicles simply cannot travel over. It was locally discussed at length as an option and then imposed on the county by central government because they wanted to be visibly seen as a solution. So my point kind of there is that, yes, there would be a help if we had local national expertise that could provide support, but equally that national expertise needs to know when to depend on the central expertise. And then my final point, I suppose, is we've had a number of instances in the UK where, because of the way that incidents are managed regionally, there is an incentive on a local area not to share resources and not to share expertise. And a big example of that is flooding, which is one of our frequent issues in the UK. So every couple of years, we will have major national flooding, and the fire service will be providing specialist equipment to deal with that. I have worked in the fire service historically, and we have requests to volunteer how many appliances we've got available. And unfortunately, because it's a local response, we will hold resources back in our local area, and that inevitably results in nationally the resources not being where they need to be. So yes, there is local expertise that knows what the best solutions are for the local areas, but what we do need as a country is a central point of expertise which knows what our plans and processes are, can give support to local areas, and can coordinate that response. So I'd be looking forward in the future for the UK to have a more mixed model of the two. Keep the excellent local resilience forums that we've got in place, but have that national function. And then I will hand back to Aaron.
Thank you, Joseph. Let me put back on. So there we go. We've had our three speakers raise observations from various areas. So if we look at the UAE, from their eyes, it's well-respected authority, highly centralized, quick command, control, and capability, and very confident in their approach. There's also a high level of compliance. There's a clear chain of decision-making, communication, and although initially, they weren't, focused on pandemic, they very quickly moved across and started reacting to what they were seeing. They implemented pandemic strategies, got up and running, and then has community across the nation, the results and the issues around the pandemic. Now, on the back of that, we're now seeing the ability to manage and contain and bring back some sort of balance to normal day living. So that's the UAE. India, on the other hand, had a very respected centralized approach again, but actually there was a disconnect at local level. And in several areas, the approach was varied, therefore leading to varied levels of implementation and success. We're seeing, as Diraj indicated, they're now starting to get a hold of it now. And we're starting to see it come up and starting to get better. But the response is more based on societal needs rather than organizational level. And we're now starting to see, that take hold. And as Diraj indicated earlier on, the fact that their stock market is now starting to soar. So you're seeing the financial bounce because of the approach they've taken. We then look at Paul. Paul talks about the US and the fact that, through FEMA, FEMA wasn't just dealing with COVID, they were dealing with an awful lot more. The size of the scale of flooding that they were trying to deal with the nation. On top of that, hurricanes and 125 disaster reports this year compared to a minimum amount the year before. And also then tied with that, so tied with the scope of the work and the fact that they're being overstretched, they're underfunded. And not as only is the flooding underfunded, they're understaffed as well. 11,000 when it should be 17,000. Now, Paul indicates there is light at the end of the tunnel. The Biden administration is pouring money into it. They've actually put FEMA as the point of the spear, for want of a better word, on the COVID response. Funding is being poured into it. You see executive order after executive order being signed to help bring in measures for the US to try and control the spread. But it's key to understand there are more Americans dying per day in the States because of COVID than there were of their soldiers during World War II. It's a heck of a mortality rate. And the daily numbers are more than all of the Americans that died on the attack in 2001. So that's just a sobering thought about that at the moment. And the need for that administration to get a grip of it, which they're doing underneath Biden and changing the approach. And then look at Joseph, who raised the UK. And in fact, again, through the local resilience forums, there's a strong decentralized approach. Okay? The subject matter expert sits at local level. However, at national level, we have seen a gaping hole in understanding at government level. Now, they don't even understand their own legislation, the CCA, and that's what the concerns are around there. So actually, as Joseph highlighted there, there is a need to move away from leaving everything at local level, local councils and local authorities, and actually create a meshed approach. There should be a organized central capability, and then underneath that, there is a fundamental maintenance of keeping that skilled, capable individual at local level underneath the local resilience forums, but supported by experts, not willing amateurs, but experts at the government level. Joseph indicates, Sage, if you're going to ask, your scientists and your medical experts what they're going to do, well, of course, they're going to follow what their information and their intelligence is telling them and their analysis. There needs to be someone else who thinks about it in the wider picture, and you can't leave it to politicians because they're generalists, they're not specialists. So with that, and putting it all together, and the fact is, the discussion was, given what we're dealing with at the moment, what approach should we use? Should we use a centralized or decentralized? I think all three panelists have indicated that the approach would be, there needs to be a bit of both in there. Centralized to give the guidance, but a local capability to actually to deliver that response capability very quickly. Now we're going to leave it and open up to questions as well. So please feel free to type the questions into the question and answer piece, and we'll pass those questions across to our various panelists. I think Steve, actually, if the team's going to be able to actually pose the relevant questions to the relevant panelists, we can start the discussion. Steve.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Just one, the latest one that's come in here, it says there seems to be very few governments providing a long-term COVID management strategy. Any idea why this is? I think there's a lot of views. It's quite interesting in the press today that we're talking about not if but when the next one comes along. So yeah, is it too early or is it too late, I guess would be the answer. But over to you, Aaron. What do you think of that and the other panelists?
I think from the research I've been involved in and where I've seen is that they still really, the challenge is they're trying to deal with a moving beast, and that ability to create that long-term COVID management strategy, especially in the West, is they still don't know whether or not the vaccine is going to deliver that effect that they hope it will, and then the various element strategies to pull it out. Because we're still seeing, if you look at the financial side for the UK, that's going to be 10 to 15 year recovery strategy because the amount of money has been put into it. From the schools and education centre, well, actually, we don't know how much damage has been done to the education of 2 to 3 generations of children, and how that is. So I think the real issue is that they're firefighting at the moment, and they're still firefighting, and they haven't. And it comes back to, as Joseph said, because there isn't that long-term, high-level strategic capability, the centralised response. they're dealing with what's in front of them rather than the long-term capability, because actually there is no subject matter expert in there to deal with that. And now that's my thoughts from what I've seen and the research I've got involved in. I'd be interested to think what other panelists think about, given their expertise and knowledge.
I mean, yeah, Aaron, you have said exactly what I was about to say, although you did credit it to me. But yeah, I was gonna say that the lack of a central, detached, something that is explicitly for managing the crisis, that therefore has more of a capability to take a long-term view on it. The government is trying to simultaneously manage Brexit, severe weather, COVID, and running a country, keeping everything together. It's very difficult to do all of that and then look 10 years in the future and start making decisions like, do we need to hold all school children back a year? Those sort of decisions, they're decisions that need to be made, but they're so complex with everything that's going on right now that I think there's a lack of capacity, as you've mentioned.
And I think, Joseph, you raise a good point there, is the fact that, when you're dealing with the pandemic and dealing with Brexit and dealing with stuff on the line, there was no one able to decouple those two things and actually say, you know what, given what we're dealing with the pandemic at the moment, we need to actually go back and pause Brexit, because you had one side of the government focused on delivering Brexit no matter what, the other side of the organization trying to deal with a pandemic and not really getting a grip of it at central level, and the two of them were actually pulling key resources left and right. And now you're starting to see, for the UK, starting to see the impact of that, of a chaotic delivery of Brexit and a chaotic delivery of the pandemic, which resulted in the worst case for both. Thoughts on that one?
Aaron, this is a good one to add one in here for Diraj, please. We got a question here. How committed is the Middle East to resilient practices?
Mm-hmm.
That's a nice one. First of all, Steve, I think I just like to say in defense of the region that the Middle East is a bunch of different countries rather than one single philosophy. And probably the UAE leads the pack in terms of resilience, because they got early into the game, developed the standard, are seen as, I would say, the center of excellence, and the others look to them and emulate what they do. So certainly Middle East is two different sets of countries, one maybe the UAE and the others who are taking guidance and doing other smart things. In my view, extremely committed, extremely resilient, and I'm really impressed what a small nation can do if it sets its mind to it. And because they've taken an approach of starting with the government sector, that's normally the fail point in most entities. So the other ones were the laggards. In this case, the government is taking the lead. So institutions where you would even say, yes, this is a good concept, but do you really need to do it? Like the museums and stuff like that, they have resilience. So literally it's mandatory by law, as simple as that, mandatory by law. And it's percolating downwards. So the UAE extremely resilient, and the others now pre-COVID and even more so now, realizing that they need it badly for pure functioning. So as a region, I would say it's coming along really well, and it really warms my heart what all they've achieved. So, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it short. So.
No, thanks very much for that, because I've got another one here for you, Paul. What does the US need to do now to better address the coronavirus pandemic? You've got such a structure in place in the US and that, but obviously there are challenges that are going on with it. What are your thoughts on that? So what does the US need to do now to better address the coronavirus pandemic?
The main issue right at the moment is to get vaccines to people. There's manufacturing activities going on. There's a third vaccine that is getting close to being approved by the government. But the challenge at the moment is not so much from a supply chain standpoint, but from an actual just supply of product. The delivery mechanisms seem to be in fairly good shape, But there are situations where you hear about. In fact, I've heard about from people I know that people are able to get an appointment set up to get a vaccination, and then it gets canceled for no obvious reason other than there's no product, there's no vaccine. In terms of a national strategy for COVID, there really isn't anything. Right now, it's mostly just man the pumps and manufacture the stuff and get it out as quickly as possible. And once it gets out, with the local healthcare organizations will get it distributed. The prior administration in Washington took kind of a hands-off attitude towards the coronavirus. The feeling at the highest levels was that it wasn't really that serious and would probably go away fairly quickly, which clearly it hasn't. We've at the moment over 430,000 U.S. citizens have passed away as a result of this. But we are making progress. Several tens of millions of people have been vaccinated, and at least that many are scheduled. But when you have a country where there's 330 to 340 million people, most of whom ought to be getting the vaccine fairly quickly, we still have a lot of work to do. So the challenge right now is to manufacture enough product to get it to the people. It's not so much a supply chain issue at the moment. It also gets confusing because we have a federal government that seems to be more focused on getting the stuff manufactured, and then the distribution of that and the actual delivery and the vaccination seems to be handled by the states. There have been some hiccups along the way in terms of the coordination between federal and state, but I think once enough vaccines are in circulation and getting distributed, I'm hoping that things will, people will be able to get vaccinated. The president's goal of 100 million people in 100 days will be achieved. But a growing concern now are some of the variants in the COVID virus that are beginning to emerge in this country, and there's concerns that the new variants, are not just the UK variant, but other variants from other areas, are more contagious and conceivably more virulent than the current COVID-19. So there's some definite challenges ahead here.
Well, that's good. Thanks, Paul, because it's another question we just come in for you, Joseph, here. I think but it's for all of you really, but I'll start with Joe here because we're short of time. Joe, do you have any views on the sort of format, structure and essential structure would take? We're hearing lots of challenges that are going on within COVID. We're looking at the whole piece, sport COVID. We're looking at any type of event capacity type issues as well. So what are your views then on the sort of format, structure and essential structure would take?
I'm going to be quite unhelpful here and say I'm open on that one. I haven't put a huge deal of thought into how that would look. So anything I said now would really be kind of pure sort of thinking out loud. My only thoughts is you need a team with experts who can feed back and forth. There was traditionally within the UK, there have been advisors who sit between government and the centre, but they were more information conduits, and so a quick win would be to make them more professional kind of subject matter experts rather than information conduits. But long term, I think it needs it needs wider thought than just me.
Steve, there's one more question come through for regards business planning and the pandemic, which I'm happy to give a quick answer to that one live. And the question was, again, open to the panel as well, is, they find that the business, that the pandemic plans have all been focused on the classic influenza scenario. Yeah, and that also caught the UK government off guard completely, because that's what all their plans are based on as well. And they're asking now, what should they look at doing going forward for COVID? Because obviously all the planning has been based on absenteeism from the office. Well, I think, if you're looking at that, you're going to have to go right back to your business impact analysis piece. You're going to have to look at the fact that not only are you dealing with individuals who are absent from the office, but you may be dealing with individuals who could, through no fault of their own, be passing it on. So that you're going to have to look at, can you operate within a distant, a spread out company or location? Have you the infrastructure to work from home? And if so, do it. If not, can you get the infrastructure in place? And then also looking at the various impacts and support mechanisms in place for your staff. Because if you're going to be a sustained working from home or a sustained spread policy, you're going to have to think, as Joseph indicated, the mental health issues, and also your working hours. Because if you're asking an individual to work 8 hours a day, screen time, that's going to cause an awful lot of implications, either to their heads and stuff like that. Also the cost, because things like this, for example, keyboards and mice and monitors, they may not have that home. They may be running off a Windows 7 laptop, which they've got because they've not needed anything else. And there may be an outgoing cost of your IT, your server kit. If you're wanting them to operate on secure or sensitive equipment, you're going to have to provide it as a business. So there's a lot of other things you need to think about this now. Now you look at no longer just an influenza pandemic risk, but actually a contagious pathogen. And that's the way you should be looking at it. It's a contagious pathogen continuity plan, not influenza. And so this now changes the game quite considerably. Panel, open to yourself, see what you think on that one. Deathly silence.
Well, I've got one here for Diraj, by the way. It's come in itself. But do you have a view on it before I give you a question?
Okay. No, I think pretty much what Aaron made says sense, and that is exactly the way it's going to go. In an Indian context, certainly, the fact is I think there is much more focus now on the overall approach, and I think it's going to really trend the way which Aaron said.
And I think, as Diraj indicated, the UK got blindsided because they thought it was influenza. South Korea were dealing with an Ebola outbreak, and they based their lessons on the Ebola outbreak. Singapore was looking at theirs on how they managed their SARS outbreak. So actually, the nations that have demonstrated a slightly better approach to this have been dealing with a more virulent and more transmissible pathogen than what we looked at, and therefore we got caught slightly blindsided.
Yeah, because this leads on to a question for Diraj here. It says the resilience approaches of India and Middle East seem to be very different. Which approach seems to be more effective?
I'd say in many cases, I've seen the Indian government, when they come and step in, they screw up something that was going really well. So as long as business is doing a great job, probably at least in India, I've said perhaps the government just should let business do a good job. Therefore, as long as the corporate sectors being resilient, don't come in and try and take it over, because something going pretty well will then get screwed up. Comes back, I think, to a few things. One is the size and scale, which makes things different. So to that extent, if there are individual pockets of excellence and entrepreneurship, let them do what they want, as long as they are not probably violating something in that sense. UAE, I would say they are young. They don't have legacy. So to that extent, they have a blank canvas. And I think they've been pretty smart about it. So I would love the UAE approach, because at least you need the direction. You may not need the tools. You may not be okay with prescribing everything, but at least they need the direction. The fact that it's mandated, I think, makes a big difference. So in that sense, in India, it's in pockets. And I'd love more regulation. I'd love more, at least the rule as far as continuity expectations are concerned. I think that's really going to bring a lot of seriousness across the board and take everyone at a much higher level. Right now, it tends to vary quite a lot. So I'd go for the rule-based approach any day.
Okay, thanks very much. Aaron, we've sort of run out of time. Do you want to bring this to a close, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at this now, we've had a really good discussion here, and we looked at the pros and cons of centralized and decentralized frameworks, and also using the current pandemic as the instigator of that discussion. And both Paul and Darius have indicated that there are strengths in the centralized approach. Joseph indicated that actually there are strengths also in the decentralized approach, provide you then give it the correct support from center. I think really, based on the information we've seen, the discussions we've had, and the questions, and the answers that the panelists have given, going forward, there's a need to really consider we create a mesh approach where you maintain the capability of local response and local expertise, and you give them the freedom to operate, the freedom to react, and empowered to move quickly. But there needs to be at government level a central core of subject matter experts able to disconnect from the situation and look up and out and not get involved in the firefighting. And it's your subject matter experts, but it's also your emergency planning teams. You can't just allow it to be your scientists or your medical advisors. It's got to be a collective, holistic group. National resilience is an holistic event. Therefore, your national crisis management team, for want of a better word, should be holistically, a group of individuals who have been brought holistically across all departments, all tenets of society. And that way, then you'll get a far better response. Steve?
No, thanks very much for that. And thanks to all the panelists for coming on board. We've gone for a very wide subject. So, I've got a range of questions we haven't had a chance to put forward. If you raise them, we'll send a response back to you through the chat and everything else. I do thank everyone who's attended this webinar. Again, if you've got any thoughts, observations, or things that the Resilience Association should be doing, please send them through to the info@resilienceassociation.org. At the same time, this is close to all our hearts on the Central Committee of the Resilience Association, and we've had a lot of discussions about this particular area. And there is a national debate going on now about this particular type of framework, certainly for the United Kingdom. So thanks for attending. Thanks to everybody. And we're going to keep you updated, but don't forget, we run the feed, the Twitter feed. So that's on at Resilience News. We have our web page, our website. So keep an eye on that. If you've got blogs or particular information you feel we should have, please tell us. And at the same time, please join our Resilience Association LinkedIn page. So thanks, Aaron, for chairing it, and good night to everybody.
Good night.
Good night.